So this evening, Mary Bodfish, whom we've seen on a number of occasions, always found very entertaining. The baby in the locket, which we really have no idea what that's about. So, air of mystery, it's all yours.
You've mentioned the baby in the locket. What I've brought you is the cottage by the well. If that's my error, I do apologise. Yes. The baby in the locket features exploring my mother's family history. Cottage by the well. Yeah, you're ahead of me, aren't you? It's my father's family history. And it's a particular pleasure to give actually either of these talks to a group such as yourselves, because I know that you will be following with me the process of research as it occurred. And for groups who aren't familiar with family history, I have to keep stopping and doing a bit of explaining. But for yourselves, that will hardly be necessary. So I have to ask you to think back a long time. When I was 17 years old, my father was sorting over some old papers that were stored in a black tin box, a deed box, lived in the sideboard. And unexpectedly, he said to me, "Come here, I want you to know what's in this box, because someday in the future, everything in it will be yours." So we tipped the box of contents onto the table and started sorting through them. And among them, I found 4 documents recording marriages, 3 of them being official marriage certificates, and this document. It's an entry written in parish register. It's not the original entry. It was copied onto a blank page at the back of the register in 1864. And it is the entry of the marriage of a couple named John Bodfish and Mary Ann Turner, who married in 1838 at an Oxfordshire village called Tadmarton. And from the information on those 4 documents, I was able at once to piece together from them my ancestry going back to my great-great-grandparents. What a kickstart that was. I'd always been fascinated by everything my father had told me over the years about his family. And once I saw these documents, I was determined to find out whatever I could about my father's Bodfish ancestors. Well, when fate sticks a name like Bodfish on you, you might as well find out how that came about. Today, I bring you stories from the lives of 3 of the women I've discovered in his family history, and to tell you as well how I came to make my discoveries concerning them. So, Tadmarton. Who located it? Tiny village about 5 miles to the west of Banbury on the road to Shipston-on-Tower. But how was I to go about research? This was 1968, and there was just one book in the local library about family history research. Well, I got it out and I studied it, and it told me a good deal about heraldry and monuments in parish churches. And I already realised that these were not very likely to involve members of my family. But I did learn about civil registration since 1837 and about parish registers and the baptisms, marriages and burials, the information. Parish registers in those days were mostly there, locked inside the parish church vestry safe. So I wrote to the rector at Tadmarton explaining my quest. To my amazed delight, the rector Dr. Arendt, got his registers out and copied out and typed up every reference to the name Bodfish and sent me the lists of baptism, marriages and deaths. Of course, he didn't have to do this, and he made no charge for doing it. I think my interest must have piqued his interest, because back in 1968, very few people of, should we say, our level were doing family history research. The lists I received from him set out the foundations for tracing the Bodfish family. Now, their line first appears in Tadmartin in 1791, with a marriage there of William Bodfish and Hannah Grantham. And it was clear that all the Bodfish entries after that related to William and Hannah and their descendants. I did eventually trace William's line back another 3 generations, but that's another story. However, working through my precious lists, I soon realised that there was no baptism for John Bodfish, who would have been the right age to be marrying in 1838. Surely he had to be related to them, but how? Well, I knew by now that all marriages that took place after the 1st of July 1837 had to be registers, and the details recorded of the father of both the bride and the groom, copy of the entry in the parish register off the General Register Office. So I thought, I will send for the marriage certificate, because there it should record John's father's name and occupation. Of course, they'd married in 1838, so duly the certificate arrived. Father's name and surname, nil. Rank or profession of father, nil. Oh, well, I'd already learned enough to realise that this almost certainly indicated that John was illegitimate. And as he was simply stated to have been over age, 21 or more, I couldn't work out in which year he'd been born. But I was so sure he must be related to William and Hannah, and my suspicions began to turn on their eldest daughter, Sarah Bodfish, baptised in 1797. Now, the banns were called there for her to be married at Marston St Lawrence in Northamptonshire to a man named Robert Austin in 1817. And from the recesses of his memory, my father drew the recollection of his own father having said, "My grandfather had a half-brother, name of Austin, who went to America." So, down here, one of the witnesses is a William Austin. Was that perhaps the half-brother? So, this is 1968. And then, as the years rolled on, of course, the census returns began to be available, of course, to scrutinise. And in the 1970s, the 19th century returns began to become available on microfilm. And up in Birmingham Reference Library on the 1861 census, I found John and Mary Ann, together with all their children, in Ladywell Walk, Birmingham. And as for John's birthplace on the 1861 census, it was simply recorded as Oxfordshire, not known. At least I got an age for him. I could calculate the year of his birth as being 1816. Well, the years rolled on, and the 71 and 1881 censuses became available. Due course of time, I got hold of them and found that there he was declaring his birthplace to be Tadmartin. But he certainly wasn't baptised there. Did he know the truth or not about his origins? if he did know, it suddenly occurred to me one day that the one time it might have been surprised out of him was the 1851 census. First time he would have been asked to state where he was born. Now, of course, nowadays we just turn to the various services on the internet to get hold of the census returns. Back then, to look at a census for Tadmartin meant a trip to Oxford for the day. There rolled the microfilm until I found the entries for Tadmartin, and I found the entry for John Bodfish, and it gave a name, Northamptonshire, and a place name that they gave as Dunsanger. Oh, I immediately got out large-scale maps, searched all over Northamptonshire, and I found a place called Dean's Hanger. Could that be it? Next day, I telephoned Northamptonshire County Record Office to ask, do you have the baptism registers for Dean's Hanger? Yes, they said. Please, could you look at the 1860 entries to see if there is one in the name of John Bodfish? They said, yes, we can do that. Call back in half an hour. Then, with great eagerness and a little trepidation, I did so. The following entry was read out to me. 7th of April, 1816, John, son of Sarah Bodfish of Passenham, servant. If I were looking for it today, I'd find it in less than 5 minutes via the internet, of course. But back in the 1970s, such a marvel being literally at our fingertips was beyond our wildest dreams. But could I be sure that this was the same Sarah Bodfish who was the daughter of William Bodfish of Tadmartin? And who was the father? Sarah was a servant. Could it have been the master of the household or the master's son? Passenham, in which Deanshanger is part of the parish of Passenham, it's a tiny place, only a mile or so to the south of Stony Stratford. And back in 1816, it consisted only of the manor, the rectory, the mill, and the manor farm. Sarah must have been in service at one of those places. Could John's father have lived at one of them as well? So, as I say, Deanshanger was actually a chapelry within the parish of Passenham, and off I went to Northampton County Record Office to examine the poor law accounts. I'd rung up, yes, they'd got them for Passenham, to see if I could find any references to Sarah Bodfish, Deanshanger at this date, which I did. On the 9th of January 1816, Sarah Bodfish received 2 shillings and 6pence from the overseer of the poor. Now, at this date, the parish of Passenham had a small workhouse. This is before the great reform of the poor laws in 1834. This was a small parish affair. It was in Church Lane, at Deanshanger. It was almost opposite the church itself. It looks as though Sarah was lodged at this workhouse, as a Mrs. Bird received money for Sarah Bodfish's maintenance. And the baby must have been born mid to late March and then taken on the 7th of April, just across the road to that little church. I still did not know for certain, though, that this Sarah Bodfish was the daughter of William Bodfish, quite a long way away at Tadmartin in Oxfordshire. And the years continue to roll on. We all know with family history research, you never come to the end of questions, do you? And hoping to put a bit more flesh on the bones of what I knew about the Bodfishers, I went to the Oxfordshire County Record Office to go through the Tadmartin Poor Law records. And I found a great many entries in there relating to bodfishers. They were poor, labouring folk. Many, many times they received payments to keep them from starvation. Then came an entry which really made me sit up. 12th of December 1815, expenses at Bloxham meeting with Sarah Bodfish. Bloxham is a village only about 3 miles from Tadmor. It was there that the magistrates sat at the courthouse. Sarah had been taken to the courthouse there. The next entry after that was expenses for removing Sarah Bodfish from Tadmartin up to Dunsanger without order, £2, 12 shillings and sixpence. Proved the mother of the John Bodfish born and baptised at Deanshanger was William's daughter Sarah Bodfish and no other. Under the old poor law at that date, having been born in Tadmartin, Sarah had legal settlement there. That is to say that the parish of Tadmartin had to give her money to live on if, being unmarried, she had a child to keep. Now she's turned up pregnant with a baby conceived while she was away living at Passenham. If she gave birth at Tadmartin, the baby would also be legally settled there and would be a liability for the parish at least until that child reached the age of 7. So now, at least 6 months pregnant, Sarah had to be shunted back again to Passenham for the parish officials there to try to fix responsibility for the baby's maintenance onto its father. Now, by this time, I'd learned a great deal more about how cases of unmarried pregnant women were dealt with in the early 19th century. Cases of fixing responsibility for an expected baby that was likely to be born out of wedlock would be heard by the magistrates at the quarter sessions held in the county towns. So, on the phone again, Northamptonshire County Record Office, do you have the quarter sessions records for 1816? Yes, we do. Booked a day off work, over to Northampton again. And I was handed a pile of bundles of papers tied up in paper with string. They were so filthy, I don't think anybody had opened them in 150 years at least. But in the middle of the bundle, for the Epiphany session, I found the form, duly completed shortly after Sarah had arrived back at Passenham when she was brought before the magistrates there, and as the law required, she had to swear under oath as to the paternity of her expected child. And the document, this is an extract from it, read this. Whereas Sarah Bodfish of Passenham in the said county Northampton, single woman, did by her voluntary examination taken in writing upon oath before John Christopher Mansell, Esquire, one of his Majesty's Justices of the Peace for the said county, on the 21st day of December last past, declare herself to be then with child, and that the said child was likely to be born a bastard and to be chargeable to the said parish of Passenham. And the said Sarah Bodfish did then charge John Meakins of Pottersbury in the said county, labourer, with having gotten her with child. So John Bodfish's father was not the lord of the manor or the vicar nor the miller nor the farmer at Passenham. He was an illiterate farm labourer from a village up the road. Then, further down the document, I read this. The said John Meakins, who was afterwards brought before for indemnifying the said parish of Passenham or securities to enter into a recognizance, which he refused to do, and was therefore committed to the common jail of the said county of Northampton until such security is given. Who was John Meakins? Why did he end up in jail? I checked the baptism records for Pottersbury, and there I found him. John Meakins, baptised in 1798. He'd now be about 19 years old. And then, you know, thinking about it. Sarah must have become pregnant in mid to late June of 1815. That time of the year, the biggest job being done on farms is haymaking. Before the age of farm machinery, so many hands were needed for the haymaking that all the workers, men and women, worked to cut and turn the hay harvest that was going to provide food for the animals in the coming winter. This was almost the only time of the year that farm hands and the typically young female servants worked together, and it led to what a famous writer about 19th century agricultural workers said: the broadest and coarsest of jokes and insinuations are freely circulated, nor does it always stop at language only, provided the master be out of sight. I need not elaborate, but this is the most likely circumstance for the conception of John Bodfish. And 6 months afterwards, John Meakins was arrested by the parish constable and brought before the magistrates, who would have sternly told him that he was faced with a choice of 3 options. Will you marry this woman? Or will you support the child? Or will you go to prison? Now, John was a young labourer. He'd only be earning about 3 shillings and 6pence a week. How would he have afforded 2 shillings a week maintenance that would have been required of him until his illegitimate child was 7 years old? So marriage was very often the outcome of a situation like this. Indeed, the banns were called at Passenham for John Meakins and Sarah Bodfish to be married, but for reasons unknown, no wedding took place. The outcome for John Meakins for slap tickle and hanky panky in the hayfield the previous June was 3 months in jail. Well, of course, I had to follow him up, and I discovered that the following year, 6 November, he married Maria Tapp at Pottersbury. They had a large family, and he died there in 1881, aged 84. Remember the name of Pottersbury. We shall be hearing it again. Now, Sarah's place of settlement was her birthplace of Tadmarton, and there was nothing to be got out of John Meakins. The Passenham poor law overseer paid 5 shillings to bear her expenses going home. And back at Tadmarton the following year, Sarah was courted by Robert Austin, another young man from Tadmarton. But their marriage took place on the 26th of November 1817 at Marston St Lawrence in Northamptonshire. Evidently, both of them were living there at the time. Sarah was pregnant, only by a matter of weeks, judging from the date of the baptism of their first child. But this I was very surprised to see. Sarah had written her name in the marriage register. Not at all usual, the daughter of a poor labourer. I've since discovered that from 1808, there was a Sunday school at Tadmarton where 130 pupils were taught reading, writing and scripture. Very unusual in such a tiny, remote, rural place. Well, Robert and Sarah came back and set up their home at Tadmartin, and they had 11 children. Their second child was a boy named Thomas, whose daughter Emma was to marry John's son James Bodfish in 1868 in Birmingham and become my great-grandmother. So you see, I'm descended twice over from Sarah Bodfish.